welcome everyone. So quick introduction. So we are Plato. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Plato. And we are organizing those community AMAs regularly, so every 2 to 3 weeks. During those community AMA, we invite the best engineering and product leaders we know. And the one goal is to learn as much as we can from them on a specific topic that they like talking about. And we like to invite friends to organize those community AMAs with us. So today we have invited Screen, the company name Screen. Vlad is an engineer at Screen. Vlad is going to introduce just a little bit what Screen is doing. And then we are going to jump into the community AMA with Gautam. So, so for those who don't know what is Plato, we, the founders, built Plato on based on a personal experience where we come from an engineering background, and when we are promoted to management, we don't have naturally the soft skills and the skills to become good leaders. And we thought that the best way to learn anything, and especially engineering leadership, is to be mentored. So to find mentors who can help you along the way and tell you a bit more about the mistakes and everything. So that's why we built Plato. It's a product where you can meet your mentors. We have 450 mentors today, engineering and product leaders. Gautam is one of them, among many, many others. They all come from the best tech companies, and they're ready to help. So this is the one-liner and the pitch of what is Plato. But today is not about Plato, it's really about Gautam and learning. And just before that, Vlad, can you maybe introduce yourself a little bit and then introduce Screen, and then we are getting started with Gautam.
Sure. First of all, I'd like to thank you and Plato and Gautam for setting this up. This is really an exciting webinar, so I'm really happy for this, really grateful for this opportunity to be part of that. Thanks a lot, guys. So I'm Vlad. I'm a Node.js instrumentation engineer at Screen. Screen is a company that do ASM, application security management. It's basically a tool you can use to monitor and protect your web application from one place. And at Screen, I am in charge of everything related to protection of Node.js. So I've been doing that for a few years, but I still think that I'm at the beginning of my career. And that's why I'm really, really excited about time today, because I've got so many questions about, and I could use this experience in the next step of my career.
Cool. So before getting to Gautam's introduction, some quick logistic tips. So you have 2 tabs at the bottom, one named chat and the other one named Q&A. So this is going to be about 50 minutes, and half of the time will be Vlad and I asking questions to Gautam, and half of the time we are going to pick questions from all of you. So anytime you have a question, go in the tab named Q&A at the bottom, ask your question, and we are going to pick among this list for the second half. So feel free, don't be shy, and Gautam will be really happy to answer any question if you have any. All right, let's get started. Gautam. So Gautam has been is someone I met about 2 years ago. When I met you, Gautam, you were a VP of engineering at Zendesk, and you transitioned as a VP of engineering of PagerDuty. I think that everyone knows PagerDuty. Everyone knows Zendesk. When I met you, one of the topics that you told me you were passionate about is what makes a great engineering leader. So we've been talking a lot about this topic, and I just felt that it was a really great topic for this community AMA to try to synthesize all the learning you had along your career. So welcome, Gautam. Thank you very much for doing this. You want to start, introduce quickly yourself and tell us a bit more about this topic and why you really like this topic.
Yeah, thanks for that. Thank you for that intro. And I have to apologize to everyone. I've got a cough and a cold. So you're going to see some tea and you might see some Kleenexes and you might hear some coughing. So my apologies in advance for that. So what I thought I would do is do an intro, take you through my career history, and then sort of explain why this idea of traits of great engineering leaders, or maybe the subtopic of people who want to sort of make that transition from IC to manager, is something that that I've been interested in. So I've been with Plato, like Kwong said, for about 2 years. I met Kwong through someone I worked with at Zendesk, and let me go back to the beginning of my history. So I've been a startup person basically my entire career. So I've been working for about 20 years, and it's always been at pretty small startups. And so my history has actually been, I started at a startup during the .com boom, for anyone who's old enough to remember that. It was about a 50-person startup. When I moved on from there, I went to a 20-person startup. My next role was to actually help found a company. So I call it a 0-person startup. From there, I went to Zendesk, and Zendesk was a pretty small company when I got there, maybe around 70 people. From there, I took a year off, and I ended up at PagerDuty, which is about 500 people. So I've worked at small places, I've worked at big places, the big places I've worked at have tended to be because I started at a place that was small and it grew, like Zendesk, or I went to a place that was small and maybe it got bought by a bigger company. So I worked at Sun Microsystems briefly, because my 20-person startup got acquired by Sun Microsystems, back in the early 2000s. But my heart has always been with starting with something small. So PagerDuty is actually a pretty big departure for me in that there are 500 people when I joined. And it's actually the biggest company I've ever joined on day one by almost an order of magnitude, with Zendesk being number 2 because it had about 70 people. So I guess the main thing here is I've always been really comfortable starting at small places and watching them grow. And my story probably takes its biggest inflection point when I helped start a company, and I think that's where I got my biggest growth. So in terms of how I made the transition from IC to manager, I was probably actively writing code, as the primary function of my job for about 10 years. Around year 7 was when I made the transition to manager. And so that was at this company that I'd helped start. It was called PowerReviews. And my story is a very common one for people who find themselves in management positions at startups. The reason I ended up doing it was no one else wanted to. It needed to be done and no one else wanted to do it. So we had 5 people. We were working out of, people's kitchens and our couches. We raised a round of funding. We got a small office and we hired our first person. And the day before they started, I asked, oh, by the way, who's going to manage this person? Who's going to tell this person what to do? I assumed someone else would do it. We had a CEO, a chief product officer. We had people who'd been in management roles before. And then there was me who'd never done any managing. And really the reason I was asked to do it is because no one else wanted to. Everyone else was too busy. So I actually got the role of management completely without any training, without any direction. And they said, just figure out what to do with this first person. And so I learned how to onboard someone. I learned how to basically figure out tasks that were useful for that person, how to help them. And then the second person showed up and they said, well, why don't you take the second person too? And so I kind of grew from there. So I actually had I had a transition which on my resume looks kind of strange, where I went from senior software engineer to VP of engineering. So it looks like a very sort of like abrupt transition. And in some ways it was. But it was also probably the most useful learning experience of my career. Because what I got was like a transition that was like very, very, I had a very low level of actual responsibility. You know, I was at a startup which had 6 people. We had no customers, and there was one other person there. So really, the fact of the matter was there wasn't a lot for me to screw up. So I had a sort of low level of actual responsibility and a high level of theoretical responsibility, because as it grew, I was responsible for everything. I was responsible for figuring out what does a career ladder look like. I was responsible for figuring out what our hiring and interview process should look like. But on day one, all it was manage this one person. And so I had this really sort of interesting experience where everything that, you know, every decision that had to be made, I was sort of making on my own, but I wasn't faced with all these decisions on day one. And I got an opportunity to grow this team slowly. So over the next, you know, 2 or 3 years, that team went from probably 1 person to maybe at a high watermark of 20 people or so. And for me, it was the best way to learn, because I was given a very, very high level of ambiguity, a high level of responsibility in theory, but on day one, it was very, very manageable. And I was basically able to take my day one responsibilities and just add another piece, add another piece, add another piece. And sometimes there were pieces I didn't know how to add, like how do we have career progression conversations? How do we deal with compensation? But they were incremental and they didn't all come up at once. And so I really loved that. And so, you know, I talk about, like, sometimes with people who I mentor, people who work for me, about different modes of growth. And I feel like my mode of growth at PowerReviews was kind of like a vertical line. It was like all of a sudden I got all this responsibility, and I had to figure out a lot of things myself. So at that job, I ended up doing lots of different things. I was doing fundraising. Obviously, I was managing the team. Sometimes I was like a part-time salesperson. I was a part-time facilities person. And so it gave me a lot of confidence that if there's something that needs to be done, even if it's not something I have prior experience doing, I can make a good try at it. And some of the things I did well at, some of the things, like, I was a terrible salesperson. But it gave me a lot of confidence that, you know, what's the worst that can happen? You know, just try these things out. So that's why I love small startups. You sort of get this really, really elevated level of responsibility because A, there's no one else to do it. And B, it's like, what's the worst that can happen? There's not a lot to screw up at an early stage startup.
Yeah.
So
you kind of arrived in management by accident.
I arrived by accident and I grew from there. So I actually kind of love that model. But in my subsequent jobs, you know, at Zendesk, at, you know, PagerDuty, like, that opportunity was no longer there for people who report to me. So I've basically taken this path of, I got thrown into the deep end. But, you know, at the bigger companies I've worked at, I now have had to learn how to take people through a more traditional path of, like, you know, measured growth with, like, specific milestones and sort of increments.
So you are actually now putting a framework on how to grow engineers to management to director, etc., which is a path that you didn't really follow yourself in the early days. That's right.
My path was straight from 0 responsibility to 100% responsibility.
So that's a really good intro of how you came into management. And what is interesting is how can we see the differences now between the way you learn and management and you discovered management to the way people from more structured organization will do the same thing. What is different? What is better on one on the other? What do you think is really different on those two configurations?
I think the biggest difference is that the way that I originally learned was, I tell people that everyone has their own management style. And that management style needs to fit into the structure that's there already. And so at a very, very small company where there is no structure that's there already, a lot of different styles can work.
Okay.
So I was able to create something at this PowerReviews company where it just fit my natural personality about how I like to run things, or what was important to me. And there was not really a lot of existing structure I had to work around. At larger companies, you still have to figure out how to match you still have to use your natural, authentic style, but it's now within a different structure. It's within a place where there's already there's already a career ladder. There's already sort of cultural expectations. And so it's much more important that your style matches, you can sort of adapt your style to what's, already there for the company, and also make sure that you can be effective, using that style. So let me give you an example. Like, I think if you asked a lot of people at my first management job, I probably was a micromanager. That was probably my natural inclination, was I love to get involved in the details. Like, I hope it wasn't coming across as, me not trusting people. It was really that I loved to get involved in the details. But at Zendesk or at PagerDuty, that option is just not there. If that's your style, is to go get involved in the details, that's not going to be a style that's workable. And so you have to figure out, like, what's actually important to me, and how do I actually sort of adapt this style to be successful in a different environment where there's a different sort of engineering culture of how the management role is viewed.
And when you adapt, I assume it's a lot of pressure because you just arrived in a new company as high ranked and everyone is looking at you. How do you manage to adapt and act at the same time? Because I assume if you don't act quickly, people will have a false expectation about your management style.
Yeah, so that's a good question. For me, one of the most important things is to say, what is philosophically important to me? So there are certain beliefs I have that I don't care where I am, like, I don't care what's in place. Like, those are my core beliefs. And that's why they hire someone into a leadership role, is what is that person's philosophy, and does it fit with do the places where we think as an organization we're strong, does this match? And the places we think as an organization we need to adapt, this is the way we want to adapt it. So I think the first thing to understand, like, how to come into an organization and, both fit, use your style, but also, match the style that's already there, but adapt the organization, is to know what are the things which, no matter what, I believe and I cannot compromise on. And so, when I came into Zendesk, when I came into PagerDuty, those were the things that I was looking at. There's a few things which I'm like, these are must-haves. Now, the second step is to say, if there's things that need to change, what is the right way to actually carry about that change? And for that, you have to go, I think, get a sense of the engineering culture. So before you make any of those changes, you can have a sense of what are the things that need to be changed. The next step is the how. And I think the how you need to be a little bit more careful about. And so the how is where you need to go actually do that sort of like broad socialization, that broad sort of, getting to know the company outside engineering, getting to know the company inside engineering, to say, what are the strategies that seem like they would be most successful? So the what needs to change, I think, is important to have a strong opinion on. The how it needs to change, you need to be much more flexible on, and take your time and get to know, like, what is the most socially acceptable way for these changes to actually get affected.
Can you give us an example of a story or something where you actually adapted the how and the how you've been able to be very flexible on the how?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let's see. Let me think about Zendesk for an example. One of the things that was very important to me was the interview process. And so I have a strong belief that, the interview process should be as inclusive as possible, but in the end, no one except the hiring manager should have a veto. And so when I first got into Zendesk, I think that they had a very good sort of sense of who they wanted, but maybe the actual process of how they were getting there was not right. So one of the things that I did was, when I first got to Zendesk, I said, I know that we need to sort of improve the sort of selection process. We were getting some false positives, we were getting some false negatives. And so I knew that we needed to basically drive the interview process towards a place where we were getting people who are much more likely to be successful. And so my approach to that was, I actually said, I'm not gonna touch this interview process for a little while, but I'm gonna participate in it. So I said, add me to every interview. And so I sat through lots and lots of interviews. I looked at their debrief process. I looked at sort of how they reach consensus. And then I started to make some tweaks. And I thought there were some places where the team that was interviewing was, there was I think a subtle shift that had to happen, where the team that was interviewing, most of the candidates was there really to provide kind of like dispassionate feedback about here's what we found. And then the hiring manager was going to make the decision about whether or not we were going to hire. And as I started to basically participate in this process, I said, I think we'll get higher quality results if I say, I don't want you just to tell me what you found. I want you to tell me whether you are an advocate for this person or whatever the opposite, a detractor of this person. So don't just give me a score. I want you to tell me what that score means. I want you to tell me whether it means hire, yes, strong hire, or no hire. And I want you to realize that you have some stake in this. Like, I want, if there's someone you want to get hired, don't just tell me this is what they did, here's what I think their score is. I want you to advocate for them on behalf of hiring them. Or if you don't want to have this person hired, I want you to actually be pretty strong and basically say you don't want this person hired.
Yeah.
So that was kind of a subtle shift in the interview process from here's what I found, here's my score, everyone left the room, and then sort of like there was a decision made after the fact.
It's a good point. Cool. So if we Gautam, get back to the initial topic on the traits of great, exceptional engineering leaders, I know you've been putting some thoughts on that, and we also need to make sure that engineering leaders is not only managers, it's a combination of whoever is on the IC track, on the management track.
Yeah.
So now you have a lot of experience on startups, but also startup that has been growing, and a big company, small company in the beginning, but now big company like Zendesk, and then now at PagerDuty. Are there like maybe 3 traits that you always see on successful engineering leaders? 3, 4, 5 traits that you always see that are always there, no matter what's the size of the company, no matter what is the company, no matter the domain. Did you have any pattern or something that you have seen?
Yeah, so good question. I'll give you 3 traits that I think I've seen in most successful engineering leaders and their teams. And then I'm going to tell you some individual traits that I've seen in successful leaders. So for me, like, it's very hard to separate the question of, is this person a very good leader from, do they run a great team?
Yeah.
So I think if you run a great team, for me, there are 3 characteristics that I found to be true. The first is that team is shipping. And so by shipping, I don't mean, is this a team that, works 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? I don't think a great leader is the one who squeezes extra effort out of the team by, cracking a whip, or even more, sort of like, less sort of like, onerous techniques. But is this team able to take, requirements from the business at large and deliver on them predictably? And have, they essentially take some requirements, say, here's how long we think it'll take, responsibly sort of like, have the ability to set their own sort of timelines, but then deliver on those timelines. So I think a great leader in engineering sits on top of a team that is delivering. The second thing is the team should be happy. And I've had some discussions in like smaller AMAs, and I've gotten some really good feedback. Like, maybe happy is not the word that I'm looking for, but it's engaged. Are the people on their team interested in the work that they're doing? Do they understand how it translates to business value? Do they understand how it translates to personal career growth? And is the work that they're doing likely to keep them at the company versus to send them somewhere else? And are the interpersonal dynamics of the team one which makes people likely to stay versus likely to go? So I just call it happy. That's the second characteristic, is they create happy teams.
Okay.
The third thing is much more subtle, which is I think that they create flexible teams. I've tried lots of different terms here. I've settled on the term flexible. To me, it means, I can explain it by small examples. Like, they create teams that don't have single points of failure. They also create teams that are able to incorporate new people quickly. You know, we have teams that are hiring, you know, we have companies that are saying we have to double our team or we have to hire very fast. Like, incorporating those people into teams in a responsible way is also a hallmark of a flexible team. And the last sort of thing that flexible means to me is they create teams that are not purpose-built to do a single thing. You know, especially at startups, things change very quickly and you might have to alter strategies. And you've built a team, if you've built a team that can only do one thing, and if we say, you know what, that one thing is no longer the most important thing, can you do this other thing? And your team is unable to sort of adapt to that, I think that's also a sign that it's not a very flexible team. So those are three characteristics of teams that I think really good leaders build. I've also generally found, on a very personal level, great leaders have a philosophy that they're able to articulate about what's important to them. And that philosophy should be repeatable as they grow their structure. So the philosophy should be something where it tells you how you should run a single team, it tells you how you should start to run multiple teams, and it tells you how you should start running multiple organizations. So the philosophy should be sort of understandable and build on each other, so that you're not basically saying, well, here's the set of rules for how I would run one team, and then here's a completely different set of rules for how I would run a second as multiple teams. And if I was running an entire organization, here's a different set of rules. Like, it should actually be explainable to an first-time engineering manager. How is what you are doing today directly translatable to, you know, where you want to get?
Okay. So first, building a good team, and second is having a philosophy that is adapted to many different configurations. What does it mean, a philosophy? Is it a one-pager? How does it look concretely, and what are some elements of your philosophy, for example?
I think one of the things that's important to there's a couple of things that I kind of lump into philosophy. I don't know if it's a one-pager. Maybe it should be a one-pager. Here are the things I believe. And actually, I had a former manager who came in, and that was the first thing he did, was he basically went through engineering. He's like, here are the things that I believe. But for me, that philosophy is something that should help resolve ambiguity. I think as you get higher and higher level leadership jobs, you are given tasks that are more and more ambiguous. So what I say to people often is, if you look at the lowest level intern who comes into a company, they're basically told something like, on your first day, change this button from red to green. Very, very little ambiguity. It's like, here's a button, it's red, we need it to be green. At the highest levels of leadership, you're generally told, come in and make your own conclusions about what's important, and then make everything better. Like, you're not given a lot of direction. And so if you don't have a strong philosophy on what do I believe, even evaluating that question of what could be better is very hard to do, because it's usually you have to evaluate sort of a situation relative to like a North Star. So you should have a North Star that you're looking for. Like, here's what I think a good team looks like. So I think it should help you resolve ambiguity. It should help explain, when you make decisions, why you made certain decisions. So when you tell people what you believe at a very high level and you make some low level decision, they should map correctly. You know, you should understand, like, oh, this decision was made because we have an overall belief that, you know, we should have clear lines of ownership, or because we should be putting, you know, customer needs first, or something like that. So I think it's really to resolve ambiguity and to explain to the rest of the team how you're making your decisions.
And to help us understand, I think it's really interesting, and to help us understand even better, can you give us some examples of elements of your philosophy and how you take decision and how you think about it? What is your own North Star? So that we can put some more concrete examples on this really important notion.
Yeah, good question. I think I have some philosophies, like I told you already, about what a healthy team looks like. So what do we prioritize? What do we reward? We reward teams we reward shipping, we reward people who are able to create a happy environment, and we reward people who are able to create a flexible environment. As another example, I have a belief that the best decisions are made out of what I call constructive debate.
Okay.
So if there's a big decision that needs to be made, I think that you get the best quality decisions when you have a broad audience that participates in that debate. You encourage sort of like multiple points of view, sometimes opposing points of view, and you have to be okay with that. You know, you have to be okay with sort of the level of discomfort of there's an important thing and there's people who feel very strongly on opposite poles. So I think that you get the best decisions out of something that is constructive debate and collaborative, but not consensus driven. So for example, when architecture decisions are being made, I think what you don't want is one person basically just making all the decisions and pushing those down on the team. At the same time, you can't have architecture decisions be just put up to a popular vote. Like you can't just say, what does everyone think? And let's have a Slido poll or something and vote on it. And this is what we're going to go with. So there needs to be something that sort of bridges that gap. And so my philosophy has always been, who's in charge of this decision? Let's appoint someone who's in charge of the decision and let's make sure that's known. But that person's role now is to solicit as much input as they can in a responsible way and actually, you know, have that be as public as possible. Like we should have public discussion about this. Everyone who sort of can contribute to this or should contribute it should feel like they've been given a voice, but ultimately one person will have to make a decision. And hopefully this process has led us down a path where the decision is obvious. I think if you run that process correctly, you reach an obvious decision because you've discussed it, patterns start to emerge, consensus starts to emerge. But if not, we're going to break this logjam by saying this person is ultimately responsible for making the decision. So we have something, for example, that we're just putting in at PagerDuty right now called the Architecture Working Group, which is that, you know, we have some significant sort of like high-level architecture decision we want to make. Let's have an open public debate about it. And we're going to have a group of people who sort of facilitate that debate, encourage that debate. And ultimately, if there's no consensus that emerges out of that group has to make a final call.
Okay. That's super helpful. Thank you, Vlad. Let's take some questions from the audience for the last 20 minutes we have. We have 20 questions, so that's a lot to be able to answer all of them. I'll let you ask the first one, Vlad.
Yeah, that's a question for Florian. It's a question I could have written myself, that's why I like it. How do you let go or keep of the technical aspect when you are moving toward management? Is it easy? Because personally, I love coding, I love building things myself.
Yep.
Right now, it's kind of in a point of my career when I have to let go some of them, and it's hard. It's complicated. Yes.
Well, I've got a very long answer for this, and it's a very personal answer. But I struggled with this too. I still struggle with it sometimes. And I think the way I've made my peace with it, because like I told you, I told you at one point I was a very big micromanager. I still want to be involved in a lot of details, and those include technical details. But it's not appropriate for me to do that anymore. Both because I'm on a management track and the power dynamic is a little bit different, and because I've lost touch with sort of like the deep technology stuff that probably makes it appropriate for me to weigh in on that. So what I've done to make my peace with that is my first boss told me something which has stuck with me forever, which is the best engineers are lazy. And so what he meant by that was, if someone comes to you and says, here's something that needs to get done to an engineer, the best ones will say, okay, how do I make sure that this person doesn't need to come back and ask me to do the same thing again? Maybe it's like there's a bug, you know, and it's like, okay, well, I'm going to write a test so this bug doesn't come back. And so that was his point. Not that the best engineers don't want to do any work. They just don't, their job is to write code that basically answers questions forever. And so over the years, I've started to realize my philosophy on management needs to be the same. And so I tell people this pretty openly. Like when someone comes to me and asks me for something, my first question in the back of my head is, how do I make sure that this question never comes back again? Like, how do I make sure I never have to do this thing again that I have to do today? And it's not saying I don't want to do it, or I'm lazy. But this is the role of management, is to basically, you know, there's questions about, okay, what do we do about this person's salary? What do we do about this, you know, about promotions? Who owns, like, what team should do this piece of work that no one wants to do? And my realization is that this is what organizational structure is. The North Star should be that you don't have to ask the question. It's obvious. And that's what a structure gives you. Who owns this? Okay, well, we have a structure. You know, we actually know who owns this. We don't even need to ask this question. And if we don't, it's fine. But we should put something in place so the next time this question answers itself. So that's how I've made my peace with it, is that I've decided that this job will be very similar for me to the IC track, in that my role is to create something which is no longer software, but it's a structure that answers all of these questions that makes me eventually be out of a job. Like, most engineers want to automate themselves out of the job they're doing so they can go on to the next thing. And that's how I view the management job too.
So did you place unit tests in your management structure or canaries to prevent overflows?
You know, I haven't been able to take my analogy quite that far with actual unit tests. But I do feel like if I find myself answering the same question or the same style of question again and again, that's an example of a place where I need to spend some time automating something.
Another question from an anonymous attendee. What's the biggest mistake you see in IC make when they begin transition from IC to management? Is it something that you know that any IC in this audience who will transition, what's the mistake you know they will make?
I don't know about the biggest. I think there's some big mistakes that I've seen. I'd have to think about the truly biggest, but I see people make mistakes on both ends of the spectrum. Mm-hmm. There's ICs who transition into management either for the wrong reasons or they have the wrong understanding of what management is. And where this industry is going, you know, 20 years ago, certainly 30 years ago, the general path was you take one of your smartest engineers, or maybe the smartest one, you make that person the manager because you say, this is the person who's making the best technical decisions. And this industry has started to move away from that more and more. Like, most places have a dual track, and the goal is to actually separate IC, you know, technical work from management work, you know, more and more. So when you see ICs who transition to management and their goal is to be able to get their sort of technical decisions and push through, either because that's what they want to do or they think that's what they need to do, that's one very big mistake. And I think that that's one end of the spectrum, is ICs who basically don't realize that they're supposed to be winding down their technical involvement and empowering others to make those decisions. The other end of the spectrum are ICs who go the opposite direction, and they have what's called ruinous empathy. I might be misusing that term, but the other extreme are ICs who basically say, my only goal now is to make this team happy. And they're not actually able to drive to accountability or delivery. And so they've kind of come from an environment where, like, here's all the things I would have wanted if I was an individual contributor on this team. And they sort of like project that onto everyone else, and they turn their job into 100%, you know, servant leadership. And so there's two ends of the spectrum. There's ICs who basically are trying to function as purely technical leads. And then there's sometimes ICs who are trying to function almost entirely as like the team's friend, not the team's manager.
Right. I will take another question from the audience. It's a very personal question from someone, but I think we can find some bigger story here. It's someone who is transitioning from IC to team lead, and they are handling a team of 12 engineers, and they are pressed to they want to have bi-weekly one-ones with their report. And currently, the CEO of this company does not approve with arguments as it costs too much. It's not a goal right now. We should focus on work right now. And this person is asking, should they push? Is that something really important, one-ones in relations? And do you have any insights or tips? And maybe it's also important to ask, what will be your relation with some higher ups when you are taking this kind of role? How do you manage to get your views seen by these people?
I think one-on-ones are incredibly important. And frankly, even I find that bi-weekly can be a little bit too slow. So I would say that's my goal is for everyone who I manage, that I sit down with them once a week. And I do miss it occasionally, but I try to reschedule it. And sometimes I can't even do that. But my goal is a once a week cadence. So I think they're very important. And if I were talking to the CEO of this company, I would say this seems like a waste of time, or it seems like it's not the most important thing. But in my experience, the things that come up in these one-on-one sort of meetings are the things that are very important. And I can tell you that if there are issues on people's minds which are having them think about, having them thinking about, is this the right place for me to grow? Is this the right company for me? And they leave, and it's become part of the reason they left is that no one ever listened to them or actually sat down to hear their concerns. That will be a much bigger dent on productivity than the half an hour every 2 weeks you spend sitting down with these people. So I would push back pretty strongly and say, in the short term, this looks like it's not the most efficient use of time, but this is risk mitigation at a minimum. This is risk mitigation to understand the facts on the ground about our people. The people at the software company are the most important thing. This is a cliche, but the Google CEOs said 99% of the value in this company leaves the building every day. If everyone just didn't come back tomorrow, this company is gone. So I really think that one-on-ones are not just a foundational important thing for the relationship between a manager and the person they're managing, but frankly, between that person who, that IC and the company as a whole. If they don't feel like they're given that space to sort of express their feelings, their concerns, their goals, and they move on, the replacement cost is immense.
I tend to agree. So when I joined Screen, I started to have weekly one-on-ones. And in my previous company, you had one-on-ones when you were yelled at. I mean, there was one-on-one were exceptional only when something went wrong.
Yeah.
And for 6 months to 1 year, each time I had my one-on-one with my manager at Screen, I felt, apprehension and I was scared of one-on-ones because I was so much made believe that one-on-ones was a bad thing. And no, I think I could not live as a manager without them.
Yeah. I agree. And listen, this is statistically, there will be some people who view them, even the ICs who view them as a waste of time, but the vast majority of ICs actually very much value them. And even my experience has been when they don't seem like they value them and you feel like you're having a low ROI or a low quality one-on-one on a regular basis, if you stop that, you'll often find out that they actually enjoyed that, they actually enjoyed that time. They weren't able to express it, but many more people enjoy it and actually get something out of it than view it as a waste of time.
I could talk also for hours about one-on-ones and how they shape the culture of Plato. I 100% agree. And we are also doing different types of one-on-ones. So the more tactical and the more step back about career, aspiration, motivation, and are you happy? Are you challenged? Are you excited? How do you feel the team is doing, etc. Different than the one-on-one, which is more tactical about where you blocked, what's your challenge tactically today? How can I help? And I think more tactical ones every week, and the more career and step back one every month or every other week, depending on some people. But I do agree that it has been really, really powerful, and it's something that it's unfortunately not scalable, but it's okay. And as engineers, we always want to scale everything, but it's the only thing that we cannot scale, unfortunately, and it's okay, I guess.
Well, it's scalable with organizational structure, and I think it's not a bad metric to use. Like, are you able to sit down with your team and do one-on-ones on a cadence that makes sense? And if you're not, then it's time to actually bring in some new layers or some new people to help support that.
Yeah. Another question, Gautam, is what are your, so you learn a lot, and I guess you are still learning today. And the question from Sami was, what are your current challenges and areas of growth today? And related or not related question from Sami, any thoughts about the importance of mentors and coaching?
Well, let me be, the brutal honesty is that my current challenge is recruiting. It's, in fact, you know, one of the things that we talked about, Kwang, was what were the themes I was finding during my interview process before I took PagerDuty, and every place, you know, is starting to emphasize that the number one job of an engineering leader right now is to recruit. And it's not just, that doesn't mean like go out and sourcing and, you know, send out emails on LinkedIn, but it's creating a structure where we can identify the gaps that are there and appropriately fill them in a time frame that's you know, responsible for the business. So that is my number one sort of tactical challenge right now, is recruiting. You know, we're growing like crazy. Everyone is growing like crazy, and finding the right people to fill those spots is my number one challenge. I think my number two challenge, just on a more personal level, is, you know, at Zendesk, my role, especially for the last few years, was I was responsible for shared services, which was really, our customers were internal. So that was our infrastructure team, or I guess what a lot of people would call a foundation team. And so we had a lot of internal customers. And so I was definitely on the, you know, engineering front doing a very similar job to what I'm doing now, but I was mostly inward looking. And at PagerDuty, my job has shifted. You know, I'm responsible for product delivery. I'm much more outward facing, and I've done it before, but it's been a long time. It's been a long time since I've been sort of on the front lines with customers the way I am here. And so just readjusting to that, it's almost kind of like putting myself in a time machine back several years. And you have to have a different sort of energy and a different sort of way of going about your work when you're dealing with like sort of external customers versus internal customers.
So you mentioned hiring is your number one challenge today. So is there something specific you are doing to grow on that? So anything you found useful at your level that is helpful for that?
I've really spent a lot of time doing personal connections and personal outreach. And I think that, you know, what people have to realize is that there are some companies, the big companies everyone knows, where engineering is, recruiting is in full service to engineering. So you tell recruiting, here's what we need, and you can expect that you will find the people that you want coming through your interview process. But that's the exception. Like, I think the more modern thing that's happening at most startups is recruiting and engineering need to view it as a partnership. And it's a true partnership where you have a shared goal. We need to hire this many people. What are we going to do about it? And there's some division of responsibilities, but we have to treat it as a shared goal. And so, you know, at PagerDuty, like, given the, you know, sort of crazy hiring needs we have, like, that partnership has taken the form of a lot more personal outreach. So, you know, we're hosting dinners for small numbers of candidates. You know, I meet people out of the office all the time. I'm doing sort of very slow building of relationships with people. So that's what it means for me personally. And the other thing is just starting to get the rest of the engineering organization sort of aligned around that too. Like, that this is a partnership. Like, we're not just able to sit here and wait for candidates to come in through the recruiting pipeline. We need to work with recruiting to sort of make that pipeline better, by maybe partnering with them to figure out, like, well, let's explain the type of candidate we're looking for better. Let's help them sort of brainstorm about places that we might be able to find these people. And so it's really sort of taking engineering and recruiting that are like this and trying to smush them together and force them to sort of like be almost more like one team rather than two separate teams with dependencies on each other.
I did not see I was muted.
Vlad, any maybe one last question, one or two? Let's see.
I think I've got a good question here from Nina, if it's not moving all the time. The question is about people you met, because you grew up with the company, with the companies you've been through and the size of these companies. And Nina is asking if there was some mentor / advisor that was impactful on your career. And I would like to extend a bit this question by asking, was there any engineer you had to manage that had bigger impact on the way you saw management and engineering management?
Yeah, I think let me answer that second one first, because I think I talked about this in a previous AMA, and I'm not gonna use any names, but I think at one of my jobs, I was still in that mode of my view of management was much more that I should be driving technical decisions. And I had an engineer who worked for me who was like, he was probably the most talented engineer that I've worked with in my career. And we have a good relationship today. Even at the time we had a good relationship, but ultimately I think my sort of tendency to go in and sort of feel like I needed to have the final say on certain technical decisions or get very involved in them was what caused him to leave the company sooner than he should have. And I had some soul searching after that, where I realized like, this is not in the long-term interest of me or the company or this person. And so there was so actually that was probably the most impactful sort of engineering and relationship I had with an individual engineer, was the realization that I was too micro involved in things where I needed to let other people make their own decisions, their own mistakes, and also to realize they're going to make mistakes, and probably the mistakes they make will be not as bad as the mistakes I was going to make. You know, the fact that they made a mistake is not sufficient to say like, okay, I should have stepped in more. I have to really be honest with myself. Like, okay, they made a mistake of magnitude 8. What if I probably would have made a mistake of magnitude 10, you know? And so that one was a very sort of impactful thing for me, was just that realization, and it helped me a lot. It was unfortunate that that's what it took to help me, but I've backed off significantly from there. And I think it's led me to be able to run larger teams and basically have more credibility with larger teams. In terms of a mentor, I had one mentor who was extremely impactful, and he was a mentor by almost not being a mentor. And so I'm going to tell one quick story, which was at one company. It was the company that I helped start. The CEO wanted me to do a sales call. It was my first, and I'd never done one before. And so I started making all these excuses, and I said like, listen, I'm trying to upgrade Postgres or something. It's really important, and I'm not going to have time to do that if I get on this call. And it was just me making excuses. And so he said, listen, I have to leave the office. I have to go down to Sandhill or something to talk to a VC. There's no one else left in this office. And so at 11 o'clock, you can do one of two things. You can continue to write your code. And he was kind of being dismissive about it. And he's like, and I'm sure it'll be great. And we will have a 0% chance of winning this customer. And he said, or you can put down your laptop for half an hour, call this phone number, try to get these people to buy our software, and then maybe you have like a 2% chance of winning this customer. And so he did two things there. The first thing he told me, first thing he did was, obviously I'm a competitive person. I was like, I know I have more than a 2% chance. It's at least a 10% chance. So screw you. And the second thing was, he was trying to tell me like, what's the worst that can happen by trying something new? Like, so what? The worst thing that happens is they say no. They were gonna say no if we don't get on the phone with them. If you get on the phone with them, they'll say no. And like, what's the harm in trying? And it was really sort of like I got on the phone, I did a sales call, I failed miserably. And you know what? I hung up the phone. I was like, that wasn't so bad. And I did a few more. I was bad at sales, but I did close one deal. And he was just a really good mentor for me at the time, because everything was ambiguous. Everyone had to do a little bit of everything. And his point was, it's a small company. This is why you do a startup. And some of it's because you get to do things you wouldn't normally get to do. And the other thing is just don't be afraid to screw things up. You know, you're going to screw things up. That's what happens to everyone. Don't be afraid of it. And so he doesn't even know it. I don't even think he thinks he was being a mentor, but that message has basically informed the rest of my career.
So yeah, small stories can have a lifelong, career-long impact on people and where you are going to be, etc. So it's a perfect transition to the conclusion. So sorry, Vlad, if you have other questions. There are many others, and we are going to pick them, and maybe we are going to answer some of them asynchronously if we can find the time with Gautam. I'm pretty sure we will in the next.
Yeah, you do it.
Thank you, everyone, thank you so much, Gautam. Thank you so much, Vlad and Screen, our friends of Screen, to help us promote this and to gather all those people to learn from you, Gautam. It was a perfect transition because this is exactly what we try to do at Plato, is to have this small conversation that have a huge impact on your life and career. One connection and one conversation can change your life, and that happened to me, and it's a whole other story that I could tell for hours. Small conversation did change our startup and the trajectory of our company, and we hope we can do this for you. That is one of the things that can really have an impact on how you learn and how you're going to evolve. So at Plato, Gautam and 450 other mentors are spending their time every single week to meet with you in person and with others in group sessions to talk about engineering leadership, about product leadership, about career, about many different topics. So if you're interested to meet Gautam and others, we feel free to give it a try. Thanks again, and on behalf of all the community and Screen and Plato and everyone who joined today, Gautam, thank you very much. We learned a lot. Hopefully see you, all of you, next time for our next community AMA. It's going to be in 2 or 3 weeks, and we have the co-founder and CTO of Gusto, who is going to be a speaker, and hopefully. Thanks again, Gautam. Thanks, Vlad. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. It looks like there's a lot of good questions in this Q&A, so I'm happy to try to answer some of them asynchronously.
Let's do a blog post or something where you can answer some of them asynchronously, and then we publish this blog post for all of you. It could be a good idea. Let's do it.
All right. Thanks, everyone.